Well, I'd say the one advantage that you're going to have over previous comparative students is that by having the notes, that you can look up examples, and that's, I think, going to really help you guys. That gives you a big advantage of previous comparative students. The disadvantage is the amount of time that you have to write in. Where are you guys all from? So I'm planning to focus on concepts and then look at examples, and then I'll spend a little time towards the end going over some of the kind of tips for the FRQs for writing them. I'd say it's kind of hard to get a word count for the essays. I think it's more if you want to think towards sentences, like how many sentences that you need to write. You're going to need to write a sentence for every term that's there. You're going to need to define every term. So then having your thesis and so on, it depends on which question. I would say for the quantitative question, it seems that it's taking 2 to 3 sentences to answer each of the like A, B, C. So I would say that would be, if you're thinking like sentence wise, that's 2 to 3 sentences per A, then for B, for C. We've got quite a mix of people. Chicago, one of my absolute favorite cities in the United States. I'm a big Cubs fan. Hope you don't like the White Sox. We'll give everybody a couple of minutes and we'll get started right at 7. I have put in the description a couple of documents that might help you. Some of them I have shared with the other teachers, so you may have seen a couple of them. If it says draw a conclusion, probably have to be more than one sentence. It doesn't necessarily have to be. You need that transitional word, has some kind of thus or therefore, moreover, whatever is drawing you back to whatever that concept is. Most of the questions that you're looking at, say in the quantitative, it'll say like explain whatever concept as related to the chart. So you have to define what that concept is, then you have to look at something, identify what's in that chart, and then bring that all back together. So almost that's like, could be 3 sentences unless you're using transitional phases. For the argumentative essay, you need 2 examples. They can both be from the same country, but they do have to come from the list. You do not need a conclusion in your argumentative essay. You need to have your thesis. You need to make sure you're defining your terms, and then you need to make sure that you have also tied in the concept. Then you'll do your parts with your 2 evidence, and you don't need a rebuttal. You don't need any kind of conclusion. And yes, you are writing an essay for the, you don't necessarily have to write a full formal essay for the quantitative. You're just answering. It's A, B, and C. For the quantitative, I'm suggesting 2 to 3 sentences because I think that's what it's taking to answer the question. So I put in the description, I put an FRQ tips sheet, and that can use to help you with your thesis. Since I'm getting so many questions about the essays, maybe we will start actually with the essays, and I will give you my suggestions for that. So when we're doing the essays, your argumentative essay, well, here, I'll just take a minute to introduce myself. Many of you I know are here because your teacher suggested that you come watch this. My name is Crystal DeLong, and I teach in Bedford, Virginia. And this is my 8th year of teaching AP Comparative Government. I have traveled and lived overseas, so I have a little bit of experience overseas, which I think helps. And I have a big passion for comparative government. It's my favorite. I teach US the first semester, so often we're doing a lot of comparisons between the two. So that sometimes can be a help for you. All right, so here we're going to begin. Let's start with talking about what our test is going to look like. So 55% of the test is going to be the argumentative essay, and then 45% of the test will be your quantitative essay. So my plan for the review for this time period is that I'm going to go over quickly the essay and what my suggestions for that, and then I'm going to be reviewing concepts and then looking at specific examples. I will answer questions as they come up, and or come back to them if I need to, if I feel like if you have any specific ones as we go through things. So you're going to see a prompt, some kind of prompt that asks you a question that's going to ask you to take a side. Then it's going to give you a course concept that you have to relate to that. And then it's going to give you countries that you're going to use to support that. Your thesis, in essence, needs to restate the prompt. We were just doing a practice one with my students before this, and the question was about political participation in an authoritarian regime. Like, why would an authoritarian regime allow political participation? So that's the question. So what we restated to get our thesis was that an authoritarian regime would allow political participation because, and then what's that reason? That's where your thesis is. You got to have that because. And we argued because it would increase legitimacy. And then there was the course concept, and the course concept was about nation. So make sure that you are defining any terms that you see in that prompt. You have to remember that the people who are grading, reading your test, that they want to see what you know. Okay, they know what political participation is in an authoritarian regime, but they want to see that you know that. They know what legitimacy means, but they want to see that you know that. So make sure that you're defining any of those terms in the concepts. Once you do the concept, then you're going to relate that back to your prompt. So as we were doing, how does a nation relate to increasing legitimacy? Well, in a lot of these countries, we see lots of other nations. Nations are people with a common group and a common language. And as they come together, sometimes they don't agree with the national government, especially an authoritarian regime. And so by allowing them to have informal political participation, you are increasing legitimacy and appeasing them. So then we chose as our choices were Iran, China, and Russia. And we did, for our examples, we did China, we talked about Tibet. So we gave the country example. You're going to get a point for your thesis there, okay? Then you've connected with your concept. And then every time you give a reason, one of your evidence. So China, what they've done with the Tibetans, we talked about that they had a certain amount of religious freedom, okay? That is my point for my evidence. Then I'm going to explain it, and then I'm going to tie it back. You always have to tie it back to that concept. Tie it back to, my argument was that it increased political legitimacy. So I've got to go back to that, okay? Be careful if you're using the Uyghurs. You have to think about, because when we think about the Uyghurs in China, the problem is that they've actually been quite repressed. Like, they're a great example of brute repression in China. The fact that they are currently being taken from their homes, put into re-education camps. So they're not getting a whole lot of political participation. So you have to think about that. I would discourage you from using negative examples. It is possible to use a negative example to get your point, but it takes a lot more explaining to get your point with a negative example, okay? So then for the other country example, we talked about Iran, and we talked about the reserved religious seats that they have for the Jews and Zoroastrians and the Christians, and how that helps increase political legitimacy as well. Then for your quantitative evidence, you're going to have a chart, and that chart might come from one of the indexes that you're familiar with. It might be something completely different. From that chart, you have quantitative data, okay? That's what the question is. You're going to then have an A point, a B point, and a C point. And all the examples that I've seen, you're not really relating those answers back to each other, but they're almost individual specific answers. So you need to answer what the question says. If there is a term in that question, okay? So if A says democratization, explain what it is. If B says political stability, explain what that is. If C says transparency, explain what that is. So you need to define what that is, and then it's going to give you a country that is related to somewhere in that chart. It is a quantitative question, so it is a very good idea to restate some specific data. The question that we were looking at earlier had members of legislatures, lower legislatures, and we were talking about the Mexican legislature, which has 500 members in the Chamber of Deputies, and the Moreno party, AMLO's party, they now control 259 seats. And so you could say that in your answer, that they have over half, that they have 259. Be specific. Don't say go number. If you're looking at a graph, don't say goes up, goes down. Say increase, decrease. If it's looking at trends or patterns, then you can talk about what you're seeing over time. But it's a quantitative, so you want to make sure you're giving specific data. And you want to make sure that your example, they've given you a country, so make sure that you're being specific with that. And don't forget to, you're going to have to explain. It's telling you to explain. So make sure whatever data you're using, you've now related that back to whatever term was in that. But they're really kind of three separate, you don't have to draw them all together in the way that you have to do on your argumentative essay. 25 minutes for the first one, 15 for the other. If you are looking to save a little bit of time, here's my tip for you. This is a tip that I got from my US government friends. The best way to get a little bit more time is to do the copy and paste feature. So if you're typing in Google Docs or Word or whatever it is, and then the 25 minutes is up, copy and paste over. While it's all, you can still type a little bit more before you have to hit that final submission. So that gives you just a little bit more time, okay? All right. I have also shared in the little link below, I made a presentation that goes over all of the CG6 countries. I also have a YouTube video that you're welcome to watch that's just on the CG6 countries. Remember, all your examples have to come from the CG6. Mexico, UK, Russia, China, Iran, and Nigeria. Okay? You can't use things from the US or whatever. It has to come from your CG6 countries. Yeah, everybody has different countries that are really kind of a struggle. I want to make sure, is there any questions more about the essay that anybody doesn't feel like that I have answered? Grammar doesn't really matter. Nobody's looking at that. As a reader, I have been a US government reader for 5 years, as long as we understand what you're talking about. And also, if you forget names, like, for example, AMLO is the current president of Mexico, and I'm trying to say that his party has made a change or this. I don't have to, you could say the new president, you could describe also. Remember, suddenly my brain goes blank and I can't remember who the Uyghurs are. Like, I can't remember their name. I could say that they are, a Turkic Muslim people who live, Turkic Mongolic people, Muslims who live, in the northern part of China. So you can describe things if you can't always remember the exact name. I was saying earlier, we were talking about the Iranian parliament, whose name is the Majlis. If I can't remember the Majlis, I can say Iran's parliament, or I could even say Iran's legislature. Okay. The argumentative essay, we don't know how many countries they're going to let you choose from. Most of the examples that we've seen have given you about 3. So I don't know, because when we did the US government, you usually had several countries to choose from for your foundational documents. So I'm almost a little scared they might make it only 2. I don't know. The other thing with the quantitative, you're going to see more countries on that. Most of the questions I've seen don't have all 6. I think the most I've seen on any quantitative question is it addressed 4 countries. Okay. And I always tell my students, there's always, countries that you feel stronger or weaker on. And so it's just kind of understanding, you may take a minute to kind of read over those, or you just hope and pray that you don't get the one that you don't know. So I think that you can go with having, as a teacher, my weakest countries, we too, as teachers, have our own weakest countries. So if you only have two countries, the advantage of having two countries is you can use one country twice. You just have to have two different types of evidence. All right. It definitely, whatever countries you have, that's the ones that you need to talk about. So what I would like to do now is I'm going to go over some specific, we're going to do some concepts, and then we're going to look at some specific examples. So that might help the things that I'm seeing right now that I'm worried about, Mexico or Nigeria or whatever country. My students are worried about Iran and Nigeria because those are the two that we had to teach. I teach by country. And so we didn't get to cover those until after we had gotten out of school due to the coronavirus. So let's go through some concepts. I'm going to start with my favorite concept that I think is super important. And these concepts are going to turn out all throughout the document. You're going to see them definitely in the argumentative, and then you've got concepts that are going to show up in the quantitative as well. And I've always told students, this is the advice that I got when I started teaching this class, that if you understand the concepts, you're going to understand this course. Because worst case scenario, you can't think of an example. If you've got the time, Google it. I don't encourage you doing a lot of Googling because you just don't have the time, okay? But you are allowed to do that, okay? There's only 3 parts to the quantitative essay, okay? All right, and in the description, I also put the link. This is the best place you guys can go. It is citizenu.org. Type it in over here. Once you get there, go over to the side, and there is Comparative Corner. When you click on Comparative Corner, it will bring you to a new screen. And this is Mr. Andy Canine, who used to write tests, used to write the questions for the AP comparative. So he knows what he's doing. He's the one who's been doing the review with the College Board. So once you get there, there are practice questions that he has, okay? And he also has reviews for every single unit with specific examples. So I would suggest that you go there, you download those documents, and you have those to use. Everybody knows how to use the Control F on their computer, where you can do the Control Find, and you can search through a PDF. All right, let's get into some specific examples, and I'll try to hit all these countries that some of you are feeling a little weak in. I want to start with one of the most important things to a democracy, and that is civil society. Civil society is probably one of the most terms that students struggle with the most. And civil society is a necessary component of a democratic society, an active democratic society. And one of the things that you see is that there is definitely some kind of correlation, okay? So we talk about correlation and causation, that there is a relationship, okay? But causation, does one thing cause the other, okay? So we know there is a correlation between civil societies, active civil societies, and advanced democracies. So of our CG6 countries, the ones that actually have an active civil society would be the UK and Mexico. Nigeria is starting on it, and our authoritarian regimes, we're not going to see one. And the CG6 really split up nice, is we've got 3 authoritarian, semi-authoritarian, full authoritarian, and then 3 democracies, and they're all kind of on the spectrum. So Russia, China, and Iran are going to fall on the authoritarian side, and then we're going to see with the with UK, Mexico, and Nigeria on the democratic side. So a civil society, if you study U.S. government, civil society is interest groups. Okay, so what we're talking about is that where citizens can pick something that is an interest to them, and they can engage and they can politically participate often through these. Okay, and what we see is that this civil society, it has to be voluntary, and it cannot be controlled by the government. So if we look at, say, some of the groups that we see in Russia, like Nashi, which is a Russian youth group, some of that's controlled by the government. So it's not civil society, okay? So it has to be Has to be voluntary, and it can't be controlled by the government. So some examples of that, if we want to think about globally, there are global civil societies like Amnesty International or Red Cross, lots of groups like that. There are also one in Mexico. Like, I try to think of an example for each of these. In Mexico, they have MexFam, which is the Mexican Center for Family Planning. And a lot of these were started after the massive earthquake that they had in 1985, where they started to see, 5,000 people died, and it was devastating, and the government didn't really do enough, the people felt, to deal with that situation. And so a lot of different groups started to form, and the priests started to lose a lot of power after that. There have been several in the UK. Probably one of the most famous is the National Union of Teachers. So you just really kind of need to understand what the concept is, and that civil society, the fact that citizens can engage in the society, have an opportunity to have a voice in the government, to protest, to participate in policy making, all of those things. That's what civil society is important for. Okay. Voluntary and not controlled by the government. And very much there is a correlation between civil society and democracies. And speaking of democracies, when we're thinking about countries like Nigeria, that several of you have mentioned you're a little worried about, Nigeria is not an advanced democracy. The UK would be an advanced democracy. We would say that the UK has experienced democratic consolidation. When we talk about, yes, civil society can be a linkage institution. Yes, exactly. Like when we think about linkage institutions, interest groups and media and elections. So yes, they definitely can be a linkage institution. So for all those names, what I would do is maybe think of an example. So if you have like a little chart where you have an example of each of these different things, I can share a link for some examples that I have done. Let me see if I've got it pulled up over here. Here we go. Here is another one. This is some of the terms that I've gone over, has examples. So that would cover some of those names that you're having kind of a hard time remembering there. So when we're thinking about those, democratic consolidation, that means that if a threat came in, your democracy is solid. It is consolidated. Nobody can kind of take it out. So right now in Nigeria, if there was an attempted coup, it could threaten their country. They had 50 years where they had coup after coup after coup, and it really, their country wasn't stable. And so when we think about that, they're a fragile state, meaning that anything, all it's going to take is kind of one incident and things could fall apart. And the opposite of a fragile state would be that democratic consolidation. You think about the United States, the UK. I would argue Mexico. It would take a huge event in Mexico right now to undo what they've done. Okay, so that's what democratic consolidation really means. All right. Now, when we think about democratic regimes, we know about all the different things. We talk about civil society, ways that people engage their citizens through referendums. Referendums is a great way to increase legitimacy. It's good to think about countries that have examples of referendums. In the UK, we have Brexit. We also have the votes on the devolution of power. Remember that the UK is a unitary state, which means that the central government controls most of the power, but they have devolved some to their nations. The UK has 4 nations: Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. And a nation is, a nation is when we have people, a common language and a culture who are together. And those referendums help increase legitimacy because you're giving those people an opportunity to have a say. Like when Scotland got to have the referendum about whether or not they still wanted to be a part of the UK, that really legitimizes it. Also, citizens are getting to vote. Think about this: constitutional referendums, those are referendums. For example, when President Putin, when they went to change the term length from 4 years to 6 years, that was a constitutional referendum. The people got to vote on it. That's the same plan. He wants to also change it so that you don't have a 2-year max that you can serve, that you can increase that. And so that also will be a vote. AMLO right now in Mexico is doing a constitutional referendum to do a recall referendum for presidents. There is technically impeachment in the Mexican parliament, but it's almost impossible for it to happen. He basically would have to commit murder to get him out of office. And so this would be a process to make it easier to impeach, to recall the Mexican president. So in democracies, you use things like this, but even non-democracies also will use techniques to try to legitimize their government. That's why they hold elections. Even if those elections aren't free, fair, and competitive, they still hold them, so it makes it seem like they're more legitimate. Saddam Hussein, when he was dictator of Iraq, he still held elections, okay? And so when you think about those, to remove Iran's, the head of state is the actual Ayatollah, and the head of government is the president. To remove, so we can go through how do we remove the executives. To remove the president, it takes of Iran, it takes the supreme leader and parliament agreeing on it, which if the supreme leader wanted him out, that wouldn't be a problem at all. To remove, we said about the Mexican president, and if the Mexican president was removed, the head of, I believe it's the Senate, would become the temporary president for 30 days till they had a decision to make. In the UK, you can remove the prime minister by a vote of no confidence. In Russia, there is technically impeachment of the president, not likely to happen. Nigeria is impeachment as well of the president. And then in China, he serves for life. He can technically be removed by the National People's Congress. A nation and a state. So when we said, the problem often is in the United States, we use these terms kind of interchangeably. So a state, this is kind of your foundation. This is your country, okay? That's what we use the word for. And then there's your regime, okay? Your regime is your type of government. So we have like the United States is our state, and then we have a democracy. We are a democratic regime. Okay, and then we have our government, which is our leader, which is currently President Trump. So if I do this for the UK is the state. Okay, so think about a triangle. The UK is the state. My regime is their democratic regime, a constitutional monarchy, and then the government is headed by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Okay, so a nation is a people who have a common culture and a common language. It could be a religious group. So if we think about nations, within the UK, like the Welsh, they have a distinct language, they have a distinct culture. The Scots do, as well as the Irish. If you think about when we go to, say, Russia has a lot of different ethnic groups within Russia. The Chechens, not to mention the Belarusians and lots of different groups of people. In China, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, those are all distinctive nations. So it's any kind of people group that have a common culture, common language, okay? Most of the time, nations do not have full sovereignty. That's really the difference. So for example, Scotland is a nation, but it's not a country because it doesn't have full sovereignty. It's still under control of the UK, okay? It's the same issue with Palestine, Taiwan, several others. Hong Kong gets a lot of autonomy, but yet Hong Kong is still very much a part of China. I actually just read an article today. They're looking at passing some pretty oppressive measures to keep protests down in Hong Kong. And the official statement from the government is that Hong Kong is a part of China that would not be let go. Okay. All right. For the vote of no confidence, it has to be called for by the majority party, and then it does take a majority vote. Okay. Think there's any other questions that maybe I've missed. Presidential versus parliamentary system. We could talk about that a little bit. It is important to know we're not going to get on every topic because, we're only just talking for this small amount of time here. There are some other review videos out there. I've done quite a few. There's some others. Global Chat has some good ones as well. When we're talking about presidential parliamentary system, so you might get a question that talks about, which one is more effective for, say, checks and balances. And then maybe your course concept in there is legitimacy or political stability, or it could be any of those. So once you've written your thesis there for which one you think is better, then you've got to tie that back to that course concept. Okay. How does that relate? So the way I've been encouraging my students to write this question is you do your thesis and then you have your next sentence that actually then ties in that course concept, define your course concept, and then bring it back in. So the whole like circle back kind of thing. So any of these things I've been giving as examples, those are things that you can use in your argumentative essay. Like we're talking about civil society, and they say, what does civil society look like in Mexico and Nigeria? And then you can talk about how that civil society is an important part of democratic societies. You could talk about the Mex-Fam as an example there, Amnesty International, you can talk about those. It will say in the question, it will say, this is the way the question is worded. I wish I could share my screen. You can't do that on live, but it says, use the following course concept in your response. Okay, it's right after the question. So it says that. I would not include the course concept in my thesis unless you felt like it really, really worked well. It needs to tie back to your thesis. It needs to be a support for your thesis. Okay, your thesis should focus on what that main concept is. Okay. All right. Let's move on to a couple of other topics. I mentioned, we talked a little bit about democratic consolidation. Let's talk a little bit about coercion and brute repression. Those are words that maybe we don't hear all the time. So coercion is whenever the government does something to try to influence us to do what it wants us to do. And so coercion can actually happen all kinds of ways. It doesn't have to be like the brute repression kind, which brute repression is extreme coercion. This is often used in authoritarian states, and that's when they actually come in and they use violence or force to put down a group. So an example of brute repression in China would be how the Uyghurs have been taken from their homes and have been sent to re-education camps. We know they're also being put into concentration camps as well. So that would be an example of brute repression. You could also talk about the amount of journalists or people who have disappeared in Russia or have been shot right in the open on a bridge. Anytime that the government is putting down groups that is or protest anything that they are opposed to. Mexico's president can technically be impeached, but might as well not. He does limit, so executive term limits. The Mexican president is limited to 6 years under the Código and cannot be reelected. Mexico and Nigeria are the most similar to the United States in the structure of their legislatures and their president. There is no vice president, though, in Mexico. The Mexican president is also much more powerful than the U.S. president. Okay. Another way that you could look at things is comparing legislatures. For example, the Duma in Russia is the lower house, as is the House of Commons in the UK. And both are lower houses, and they are much more powerful. And the prime minister, when we think about this parliamentary system that we see in the UK, there's no separation of the executive. The legislative and executive are together. The prime minister is not directly elected, while a president would be directly elected. Directly elected by his majority party is who the prime minister is chosen from. And the prime minister is the commander-in-chief. Prime minister has the right to do a referendum. And because there is no separation of a separate executive, they come from the majority party, so there's very little gridlock. You're more likely to have gridlock in a presidential system because you often end up with divided government. Though Mexico doesn't currently have divided government, as AMLO's party, the Moreno, controls both houses. So there is a bicameral legislature in Mexico. UK has bicameral, so does all this is in the one of those I shared with you, the CG6 sheet. Let's see, I can share that with you again if you don't. When we think about the parliaments and all those, there's a lot of power that these parliaments have, and some of them are more powerful than others. Like, for example, the Chinese parliament is has no power at all. The Chinese parliament, all it does is rubber stamp whatever they're told. They meet for 2 weeks. They can't get anything done at that point. Instead, it's going to be your Politburo and some of those other higher level groups that are doing those. Social media, joining other forms of informal participation other than protests and social media. I would say joining a interest group or civil society would be another way. Writing your legislature. Those are things that you can do. Okay. All right. Iran is a unicameral and legislature, and so is China. The modulus does have some power, but the real power in Iran is held by different groups. So when we're talking about Iran, let's switch over a little bit to Iran. Iran has the Ayatollah, who was elected for life. The current Ayatollah has been serving since 1989. He is chosen from the Assembly of Religious Experts. There are 86 members of that. You don't need to know the numbers. And then the president is elected for a 4-year term and can serve up to 2 4-year terms. The Ayatollah chooses 6 members of the Guardian Council, and 6 members. The other 6 members are chosen by the Chief Justice of their kind of court system. And the person who chooses that Chief Justice, of course, is the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader is the Commander-in-Chief. He controls the military, the media, the mosque. It really just has absolute power. He could get rid of the president if he would like. There is also the Expediency Council, which handles kind of disagreements between any of those groups. The Guardian Council is super important because they have the power to veto any law and the power to vet candidates. This is one of the reasons that we cannot see Iran being considered democracy, because they don't have fair, competitive elections, because not everybody who wants to run can run. So yes, everybody has a bicameral legislature except for China and Iran. The House of Lords in the UK and the Federation Council in Russia, neither one of them do a whole lot. Federation Council, though, has more power in Russia because they approve a lot of appointments. But the Russian Federation Council, though, those members are not elected. They're appointed by the state regional governors and the state legislatures. So when I think about a democracy, the procedural versus substantive democracies, to me, that's really illiberal and illiberal democracies. So a procedural democracy would be democracy that looks good on paper. So if I've read Russia's constitution, they seem to be very democratic. That they're not, okay? They have freedom of assembly. They have judicial review. They have rule of law. They have freedom of press, freedom of speech. All that's in their constitution, but it's not happening in reality. Substantive democracy, on the other hand, is democracy that we would see that has substance to it, that we know that, like the UK, that there is rule of law. Rule of law is also a great term, guys. Rule of law, that is super important in countries. Rule of law, do you follow the laws, processes? If somebody gets arrested, do they go through due process? The other option is rule by law. That happens often in authoritarian states. Like in China, it's more of rule by law versus rule of law, because rule by law is that intense, that arbitrary decisions can be made by a leader at any point. Democratic countries don't necessarily have to have a bicameral legislature. For example, Japan is a democratic country and they have a unicameral legislature, the Diet. Yes, that's pretty accurate for what I see up there about the others. So corporatism, that's corporatism and pluralist. Pluralist would be a group that has an active civil society. So UK and Mexico used to be corporatist, but now they're pluralist. So think about, if you're familiar with the term pluralist society from US government, where interest groups have an active part in political policy making. And that's what we're talking about with pluralist. And corporatist is that it's businesses and the government elite groups that are making those kind of decisions. Well, if you could relate the coronavirus as evidence, so like how Nigeria has handled it, how Russia has handled it. I was starting to read an article today, but I didn't get to finish it about how that the coronavirus is actually way worse in Russia than what the Kremlin is sharing. So, yes, rule by law is definitely authoritarianism. The Assembly of Religious Experts are elected in Iran. That is correct. How would you use the coronavirus as a current event? You'd have to have the knowledge of how that country is working. I don't have enough to give you like a specific example. I have a friend in Nigeria and I've been talking to him, but I don't have like kind of a specific example. Corporatism would not be necessarily informal political participation because it's controlled by the government. Yes, and the Guardian Council has to approve all of them because they vet all the members. Cleavages within society serve as a benefit. That's a good question. If you can have, cross-cutting cleavages where maybe that my gender, but my social class and my religion, that brings people together. When you have reinforcing cleavages that just you only are in those same groups, that makes it very difficult and usually brings a country, tears a country apart. Most of the time we think about cleavages, we're talking about divisions within society. You definitely want to know some examples of cleavages within each of the countries that we're studying. A lot of them have urban versus rural as a big one. When we're thinking about religious, that of course would work with Northern Ireland with the Protestants and the Catholics. You could talk about the Western versus Slavophile in Russia. You could talk about the urban versus rural, which is a lot related to kind of modern and traditional or conservative in Iran. Yes, no, he is. They're waiting. Sorry, there was a question about the Ayatollah is the religious figurehead in Iran, that he's the placeholder for the 12th Imam, which is the hidden Imam, which is a whole big religious conversation we're not going to get into. But yes, he is very, very, very important. He is like the Pope for those who are Catholic, if you can make kind of a tie there. All right, North versus South. Mexico is another great example of a cleavage as well. Yeah, and although it's not as clear like Muslim North versus Christian South in Nigeria, but definitely all the different ethnic groups, the Hassau Fulani, which is predominantly in the north and are in that Sharia law area, the Yoruba, the Igbo, yes, when we're looking at industrialized and South, poor, all those are really good. Yes, good ones. Neoliberalism in China and the UK. Fantastic. Okay, we'll go with that. All right, so neoliberalism, that is a super important ideology term that you need to know. So neoliberalism, when I think neoliberalism, I think capitalism, and I think that's the best way to go. So we're talking about an incorporation of free market policies. So in the UK, Margaret Thatcher, when she took over as prime minister, which was a switch to the Conservatives, she brought in neoliberalism policy. She believed that the welfare state is an important concept. Welfare state is when your country provides for basic needs for people, such as public education, social security, pensions, retirement, unemployment, housing. Okay, those happen in almost every country that we're talking about in some form. And you do not have to use current events. They can be historical. It just depends what the question is saying. So, excuse me, for the welfare state, she believed that it was hurting the economy. They had gone through a recession. So she cut back the welfare state and she brought in neoliberalism principles. So that means opening up free trade. It also means that we're going to privatize businesses. So instead of the government owning businesses, it's going to be individuals. Because when you're thinking about economic systems, it's all about who owns the factors of production. If they're controlled by individuals, that's a capitalist society. If they're controlled by the government, it's a command economy, which is communism. Somewhere in the between, where the government owns some and people own some, that's socialism, which is how most of the world functions today. So Margaret Thatcher brought in some of that. Now, in China, after Mao died, there was Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping, he brought in his 4 modernizations. And with that, he also brought in some neoliberalism as well. He brought in some of those free market principles to start privatizing some businesses. And so all those led to an increase in their economy. He believed, there's this very famous quote from him, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse. Basically, it doesn't matter if we're using communism or capitalism as long as we are making money. Okay, so we also see that the more economic freedom that people get, the more political freedom that they demand. So we saw that in Tiananmen Square. So again, that's not just a correlation, that's also a causation. Okay, that the more economic freedom people have, the more political freedom that they demand. So in Tiananmen Square, this would be an example of an authoritarian regime using brute repression to put down a group that they did not agree with. In the 1980s, 89, I believe, when they put down the students who just wanted more democratic freedoms. Okay. All right. What are some other questions that you have? Some topics I can look at my list for some other ones that I can cover, but I want to make sure if there's any topics, questions that you have. I'll mention terrorism as well, because that was something that came up in my discussion with my students this week. And so when we talk about terrorism, knowing that Boko Haram is active in Nigeria and that ISIS or ISIL, whichever you prefer, have done terrorist attacks in the UK, particularly like in London, the bombings that they had on July 7th, the 7/7 bombings. So the Modulus is not the Guardian Council. They are two separate things. The Modulus is the Parliament. The Guardian Council is a 12-member group. The big man elitist system. Are we talking about like pre-Bendelism with the corruption and the parent clientelism? Yes, that does still exist. Post-materialism is an important term that talks about countries that get to the point that they're not so focused on serving the kind of, they're covering the basic needs, and they start focusing on things like the environment and social equality and things like that. Countries that are presidential, parliamentary. More economic freedom, yes, has led to more laws like copyright and business laws. All right, countries that are presidential versus parliamentary. So Mexico and Nigeria are the only two countries we study that are fully presidential, okay? The UK is the only country that we study that is fully parliamentary. Russia is a mixed system, semi-presidential. They have a prime minister and a president. Iran, I would argue, is also semi-presidential because they are a mixed system because they have the Ayatollah and a president. And then if you want to argue that China is a mixed system, they have a premier. He doesn't really do anything, and they have the president. So they're just really kind of an authoritarian. Federal versus unitary. Let's make sure we got that. It's 3 and 3. China and the UK and Iran are all unitary. Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia are all federal. That always makes a fantastic question too. Why would you choose to be one over the other? What are the advantages and disadvantages of federal versus unitary? And why do unitary countries choose to devolve power? Why did the UK choose to give more power to Scotland and to Wales? Federal systems allow for experimentalism. They are better in large countries, especially in diverse countries. So why doesn't China, which is large and diverse, have a federal system? Because they don't want to give up any power. So the unitary helps them maintain power. What are the key things we should know? Guardian Council, yeah, that's kind of a good way to think of it, Cayman. I think that'll work. The Politburo Standing Committee, the National People's Congress, and the Central Committee, each of them go further up. You know, you just have to think about who's at the top and who makes the decisions. Like the Central Committee, and the standing committees, they're the ones who actually choose the General Secretary or the President. They meet in secret, and they're the ones, you know, with the Politburo who are making the real everyday kind of decisions that are key in the party. Ayatollah and Supreme Leader is the same thing. Ayatollah is just the Farsi word, Iranian word for Supreme Leader. The Ayatollah is the head of state in Iran, yes. And he was not the first Supreme Leader. The first Supreme Leader was Khomeini with an O, and the current one is Khamenei with an A. He is the highest cleric, like the Pope is a good example. The institution that's the mediator between the Guardian Council and the Majlis is the Expediency Council. Civil society in Iran, China, and Russia doesn't really exist because civil society, remember, has to be voluntary and not controlled by the government, and they don't really allow it. They do have groups, but they are controlled by the government. Federal system is better in a large and diverse country because it allows for the regions or states to make decisions that are best for their areas. In a unitary system, it tends to be an equal distribution of resources. And so in a federal system, think about in the United States, what California needs is not necessarily what Idaho needs. What Texas needs isn't necessarily what Vermont needs. And it lets us to decide on our own. Experimentalism. Look how that some states have legalized marijuana and others haven't. So that's a way to do that. Key things for each country. Okay, so I shared a little PowerPoint with you earlier. I would definitely look at it. So here's what I would say, key things for each country. All right. Mexico, the PRI dominated for so long, for 70 years, but they have now, since 2000, the PRI is no longer dominant. They still face issues with some corruption, and there was a lot under the previous president. And of course, the issue with the drug cartels. When I think about if you have a problem with the question about Mexico, I always tell my students they're function very much like the US. It's kind of a way to think of. So I'm going to do these in the order that I teach them. The UK, it's all about tradition. It all goes back to what they've always done. They follow common law. It's based on precedents. It's based on what they have done in court cases. They have no written constitution. So everything kind of goes back to that. The prime minister is very powerful, and they have less gridlock because of their unitary system. It is important to remember the devolution that they have given to Scotland and them. One of their biggest issues facing them is Brexit and how they will proceed with that. Russia, it's all about Putin, who has been in some form of power your entire lives. He has been in some form of power since the late 1990s. He was president, prime minister, and he just continues to rule and takes on more and more of an authoritarian role by restricting civil liberties, by killing people or having people killed he doesn't agree with, arresting people who tried to, the young riot girls, they were arrested. They're a wonderful example of how people were put down for protesting against the government. Moving on to China. What do you know about China? China, it's all about the Communist Party. Everything goes back to the Communist Party. They don't even have national elections. What democracy does happen in China happens on the local level, happens at a, in a way that you can participate locally. But everything goes back to the party. Xi Jinping is now serves for life. It used to be 10 years, but they changed that, and now he serves for life. His power gets more and more powerful. Iran, it's all about the 1979 Iranian Revolution, changed the country. They are the theocratic republic, Islamic theocratic republic of Iran. They are the only Islamic theocratic republic in the world. And they are one of the few theocracies in the world, but they're the only theocracy that is a republic. Most of the theocracies that we see in the world today are where you have your religious leader and your political leader are Muslim. And this is the only one where they have elected leaders. But it is important to remember that power, there is so much absolute power in the hands of the Ayatollah, and that the Guardian Council's importance in vetoing and vetting the candidates. Nigeria, it's all about the different ethnic groups and the fact that has been a struggle for their country. They even have should they even be a country has often been a question. Can they even provide for the basic needs of their citizens? There's so much corruption there. Things have gotten better. They do have, in 2015, it was the first peaceful transfer of power from a president from one party to a different political party. And this is a country that had series of coups, military coups. And so they have faced a lot of different issues, but a lot of it revolves around the ethnic groups. They, of course, have Boko Haram in the north, and then there's Sharia law in the north. All those things are part of that. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of of things. The president from the north and then the south, the rotating. It used to be, it's kind of an unwritten thing. And good luck Jonathan actually didn't win his reelection, so it doesn't necessarily hasn't worked for that. Oh yeah, somebody was asking about the cleavage of Westerner versus Slavophile. So like Putin would be a Slavophile, fan of the Orthodox Church, the being against kind of Western culture and wanting to move more that way. So sorry if I offend anybody, but the Riot Girls are Pussy Riot. You can Google them. They're a punk rock group who protests President Putin, and they were arrested several years ago. Some of the girls, they've been traveling around. They're very, very anti-Putin. Their biggest thing that they did was they protested inside of an Orthodox church and got arrested. 2 years in prison, one of them, for that. GDP for countries, you're looking at your economic gross domestic product. I think you mean HDMI, which is Human Development Index. Those are things that you might see on your quantitative card. Let's see. I would agree that Iran and northern Nigeria would be the most oppressive towards women. Though in Iran, they did lead quite a bit in the Middle East in the fact that they were some of the first in the Middle East to allow women to drive and to vote. Turkey, much better than them, but at least Iran, better than like Saudi Arabia and Oman and Yemen and some of those others. Women are allowed to serve in parliament in Iran, and they have had a increased number in college. At one point, there was significant number of women in college. And the Sharia law definitely impacts a lot of that. It's also culture as well. Advantages of presidential versus parliamentary. Here's a quick. Presidential has more checks and balances. Parliamentary, the biggest advantage would be that there's less gridlock. You might also want to look at the cabinets, how they're chosen in presidential versus parliamentary. Parliamentary cabinet members are chosen all based on party loyalty, not necessarily on knowledge. HDMI and the human development growth they are indicators of your GDP, HDMI, all those things are indicators of the development of your country, and they can be used to tell us, give us indicators, maybe how well your country is doing, how democratic that you are, those kind of things. Second ballot system works. So you won't have questions about electoral systems on this test. So, but basically, if nobody gets the majority, if they don't get over 50%, they take the two highest candidates and they run again. Devolution, go Senators. Hi from the students of Dover High School. Feel free to give shout out to your teachers or such. Pros and cons of devolution. It really, I would say the biggest thing is that it gives more authority to those states. I would say maybe the one negative is that maybe they might want to break off like Scotland did. Gridlock, where policies and laws are not getting passed because the two parties can't agree on things. So if you think about the United States, that happens a lot because we have divided government right now because one part of our government of Congress is a Democratic controlled House and the other is Republican. So when you have different parties controlling things, it makes things more difficult. Minority groups in Russia, I would focus on, you could look up all the different names because I don't remember them all off the top of my head, but I would focus on, if I had to pick one, I would talk about the Chechens, who are a Muslim minority group who have their own state, and their state is also very rich in oil, and they've had a lot of terrorist activities, and they are unlikely to ever be let go. The welfare state definitely exists in the UK. And it is very, very good at providing for discounted colleges, for providing subsidized housing, providing for universal health care, all those kind of things. The things we see that would be welfare state in our own United States, because we have parts of that too, the fact that we provide for unemployment, like what we're providing right now for all the people who don't have jobs because of Corona. That would be a wonderful example of that. Oh, independent judiciaries. That's one of my favorite topics. I love talking about courts. So when we think about independent judiciaries, part of the problem is that very few of these countries have them. They don't have real true independent judiciaries. So like in Russia, they don't have a true independent judiciary. They have judicial review in their constitution, but it doesn't really happen. And so that is actually a very big issue. Independent judiciaries are important to ensure rule of law. It would be an important concept of democracy. And I would argue that you can't have true rule of law unless you have an independent judiciary that has free judicial review. And if the independent judiciary does not feel that they have the right or the freedom to make their own decisions, then without control or influence, then it's not an independent judiciary. Yes, thank you, Cayman, for that. The pros of devolution, putting that. All right. Well, guys, we're getting close to the end. Social cleavages in Mexico. I just saw that question. North versus South, urban versus rural, Amerindians, which are the natives, versus the mestizos, which is the majority of people, and which are European and Amerindian descent. And an example of that would be the Zapatista movement after NAFTA was passed, which was a neoliberal policy because it's free trade. They protested. Chechny's bombing. Yep. Let's see. Yes, there are some more indigenous groups. So Chechnya in Russia. So the Belarusians. There's lots of different Slavic people. All the different Slavic groups. So I can't ever remember all their names. There's quite a few. Yeah, the Zapatista army. They were in the Chiapas was the state that they were in. So, all right. Well, I'd love for you all to be able to go to do the quizzes review with Mr. Jacobson. So I'll take just a couple more questions. And democratization in the UK. So the growth of democracy really, I would talk, for me, it's the Glorious Revolution. But it's happened over time, and it is definitely a very solid democracy. Expansion of suffrage, giving more people the right to vote, is one of the ways that we see democratization. We see increased political participation, like Mexico has used gender quotas to get more women. The Labour Party in the UK actually used gender quotas to get more women in there. Judiciaries for each country, I would say that Mexico is fairly independent. The UK is independent. Nigeria, and then not independent in Russia, Iran, or China. It is not history-based. It is political science-based. So, those are just, you just use examples. Mr. Jacobs said I have 4 more minutes, so go. Assembly of religious experts are voted on in Iran. Throw me your questions. Keep going. Judiciary does not have as many judicial review as its constitution is unwritten, but more remembered. Yes, the UK, it's based on common law. And so they're always looking at precedents. It actually gives them a little bit more freedom because they don't have that necessarily going back to the Constitution. The Zapatista movement, it was named after Emiliano Zapatista, who had fought when they got their independence back a long time ago. And Mr. Jacobson, can you throw the quizzes review in the link? Do you have that on you real quick? The Zapatista movement is, so they were in the Chiapas, which is one of the states in the South, and they were very opposed to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And so immediately the day that it was signed, they just basically rose up in arms and took over some different things. A couple people died, I think like around 30. I know that's more than a couple. But eventually it was put down, and their whole point is that they wanted more rights, and they were very opposed to the what the Mexican government was doing. Okay, any key concepts like a doc? There's no, I did share one. It is, there's a terms to know one. I'll share it again. Here is the one that is my key concepts, and it also has, putting it in here right now, these are the key concepts, terms to know, and then it also has examples for each of them. All right, any other questions? I see some shout outs, but I don't see any other questions. Time management tips. No, I'm sorry. I don't really have any time management. Oh, asymmetric federalism. Oh, that's great. I don't think you need to know a whole lot about Russia's different types of provinces, not for this particular test. But the Asymmetric federalism is that it's not distributed equally to everybody, and because there's definitely some favoritism in Russia. You guys are very welcome. My last name is actually French, and but I'm Scotch Irish. It was a little bit of smattering of German. Yeah, so definitely, guys, make your own copies of any of the documents. I put that as a note at the beginning because if you're using any document that is shared, you could be getting yourself in trouble. So make sure you make your own copy or download it as a PDF. It is a very similar rubric for the argumentative. Dorian. And thank you guys all for coming. And I do, if you want, I tell you the one video I think that might be helpful for some of you that ask some country-specific questions. I do have a CG6 review video where I review all for all 6 countries. Some of it is stuff that won't be on the test. Remember, they're only covering units 1, 2, 3. Okay, I will give you guys the link to Mr. Jacobson's quiz thing, which is kind of a fun way to end. You know, guys, what I've told my other kids, you guys are going to be fine. I tell you, the nice thing, you can look stuff up and you're going to have those examples in front of you. So all those things definitely are going to benefit you. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the thing to pull up. And okay. So here's the quiz link for Mr. Jacobson. So yes, wishing everybody best of luck tomorrow. Just do your definitions. Yes, you can use an example of the UK and the EU on the exam. You can always use past examples. Stay confident, definitely. I'm so glad that I could help you guys, and I wish everybody the best of luck. If you're the kind of person who benefits from waking up early, study, sure. For me, I would have benefited from sleeping in a few more minutes. So you have to decide based on your time. But yeah, there's definitely some things you could do. Yeah, you put Mrs. Drenfield is right. You guys have put in the work. Now's the time to shine. There might be a few more key concepts that I didn't touch on. I shared that document with you guys that has all the ones that I thought were super important with that. Because I know I'm looking to see over, we didn't talk a lot about legitimacy, which I think is a really important term. And we didn't talk a lot about, I think maybe that might be the only one that we didn't, and sovereignty and authority, that's another one that we didn't talk a lot about. There is an 8 a.m. review as well. Yes, Mr. Jacobson is doing that quiz review at 8 a.m. There's going to be a lot of international students on that one, so that'd be a really great one to participate in. Yes, we're definitely hoping, I think at this point they've got all the nice thing about being on the last day of taking the test is they worked all the bugs and kinks out. Yes, you can get more practice if you go to citizenu.org and you click on Comparative Corner. It'll take you to another page, and Mr. Kaneen has made lots of different practice questions that all relate to the units 1, 2, and 3. The 8 a.m. review is going to be on quiz. I believe it's going to be the same link that Mr. Jacobson is using. And yes, you are welcome to come to the review if you are not our students. So the quiz link that is for tonight, it's going to be the same one in the morning. So if you can't go to the one now that he's starting now, you can go to the one at 8 a.m. Hi, Rosa Melchongo. I'm sorry. All right, all the flirting in the chat. Okay, all right. It's not the same link. Okay, so thank you all. I'm gonna peace out now, and you guys, best of luck. Different link for the 8 a.m. morning one. So let me take that out then. Different link for the 8 a.m. morning one. So you guys got any more questions? Feel free to send me a chat. Check out some other videos if you feel like you need some review. I did do a review that was just on Unit 1, one on Unit 2, one on Unit 3, and I did another review. I have a playlist I can share that with you if you would like. This is my playlist of videos. If there's more that you would like to watch. So, all right. So, Gusharus, best of luck on your comparative test tomorrow. I don't know how you get to the 8 a.m. review. Mr. Jacobson has not shared that one. So if your teacher's in the AP Facebook group, they might have it. He hasn't sent out the link to the 8 a.m. one. So if I get it, I can post it on here, but I do not have that one. So sorry to say. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you all for joining, and have a lovely evening, and good luck.